I, I wanted to go back to an observation that Professor Lee made. He noted that if sanctions are effectively imposed and hard currency is cut off, the rise in the number of disgruntled men in the party bureaucracy and the military would, more than any conceivable variation on artful nuclear diplomacy, give the Kim regime reasons to rethink its long-term strategy. And in the same vein, looking back on your efforts, Dr. Asher, in the last administration, you say that the effect of the campaign froze North Korea out of key aspects of the international financial system, and that produced a destabilizing internal effect that could have been magnified to compel North Korea to abandon its nuclear program. Pretty definitive statement. I wondered if our panel might elaborate a little bit on the impact on the regime's financial lifelines and its effect on the regime's mindset, with an eye toward whether this could be redone again if we went with legislation to try specifically to replicate what was done with Banco Delta Asia. I'm working on legislation, and I wondered how could Congress help in this vein? And we'll begin with Professor Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The notion that sanctions are not necessarily effective because they do not necessarily lead to regime change or a fundamental change in the behavior of autocratic states, I would say is not particularly relevant to North Korea. I would argue that North Korea is uniquely vulnerable to targeted financial sanctions because unlike any other authoritarian governments in the world, the regime is so dependent on such revenue streams, illicit streams of revenue. So blocking, damming, if not all, even some of those streams of revenue would achieve secondary, tertiary effects in any sanctions regime, which is to provide that regime, that target, with a psychological threat of prolonged sanctions that would lead to a increase in the number of disgruntled men in the North Korean party, bureaucracy, military. This is an existential crisis for the regime. How much does the regime depend on such illicit earnings? Well, we don't know for sure, but I know that Dr. Asher and others have estimated that as much as perhaps 1/3 or even as high as 40% of the regime's total trade, and probably a much higher sum in terms of the regime's cash earnings, are derived from such criminal activities. So North Korea is singularly vulnerable to such targeted sanctions, I would say.
I'll ask you, Dr. Asher, to chime in on that. I remember I was in North Korea in 2007, and afterwards had an opportunity to talk to a defector who had worked in their missile program. And he told me how obtaining hard currency was so difficult that the whole production line at one point was shut down, I think he said for 7 or 8 months, because they couldn't get the hard currency to buy on the black market gyroscopes that they needed for the program. But let me ask you your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think the key to the effectiveness of our program of action during the Bush administration's first term was we created a very sophisticated model working with Ambassador Detrani in his previous capacity and other members of the intelligence community, as well as doing a lot of open source research on businesses. Businesses have public records associated with them. We understood that North Korea's financial lifelines were centered outside of North Korea. North Korea did not have its own internal banking system. It was largely resident in places in Southeast Asia and Austria, in Hong Kong and Macau, places that we could get to. And given the fact that there was a disproportionate association between the high-level regime finances of Kim Jong-il and his family and illicit activities, we knew that by combining law enforcement as well as targeted regulatory actions involving the Patriot Act, we could affect those finances. And we did so in a way that was aiming at specific individuals, specific actors, specific institutions. We didn't just go willy-nilly at this. There's a sort of black art behind the way that this was conducted, and I think that's why we had an effect. I believe the same could be done today, but it's going to require a use of coercive force against Chinese institutions and actors and trading companies that will require considerable resolve by the administration.
Ambassador, your thoughts, and then we'll close.
No, I agree with Dr. Asher and Dr. Lee. I think they are biting. I mentioned the executive order, Treasury's Executive Order 13382, proliferation of WMD and their supporters. I mean, entities like the Tanchon Bank, COMID, the Korea Mining Trading Corporation, these entities are being sanctioned, but anyone dealing with them would come under the same ruling and have the same consequences for dealing with them. So yes, and I, in addition to the sanctions, which are biting and are very, very important, I believe the Proliferation Security Initiative, by getting all our countries together to ensure that North Korea does not proliferate and does not receive the materials that are necessary to sustain their programs is so vital. And I think we're moving, I think, pretty aggressively and with significant success in that area. And as Dr. Lee said, I think it is biting, because eventually it's going to have consequences. You've been there, Mr. Chairman. There's two North Koreas, the provinces where the leadership in Pyongyang really doesn't care that much, and Pyongyang itself. Well, eventually, these sanctions are biting those elites, those in Pyongyang who rely on this flow, and that's going to cause some significant pressure on the leadership, and that I think is powerful.
Thank you. Mr. Engel.